I am Allison, 32 years old, and I have been dreading this family meeting for months because my siblings always had a way of making me feel small with their subtle jabs about my modest lifestyle. And little did they know, the company I built from scratch had just sold for millions. And while I chose to drive a teen-year-old car and live simply because possessions never defined me, their judgment about my worth was about to change dramatically today. And the helicopter was just the beginning of their education. So before anything else, I'll say this to you watching. Drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from. Hit like and subscribe if you've ever been underestimated by your family, because what happens next is something you won't want to miss. And to understand why this matters, we have to go back to Cedar Springs, where growing up as the middle child between my older brother James and my younger sister Stephanie meant living in the quiet space between two spotlights, with James, now 40, embodying everything our parents were taught to prize: Ivy League polish, Fortune 500 title, corner office, and Hamptons weekends. His life a slideshow of status updates at every holiday dinner. And Stephanie, 28, choosing a mother track to prestige by marrying Andrew, heir to a regional banking fortune. Her magazine-worthy weddings and endless gala photos fulfilling our parents' dream of a daughter framed by pearls and country club pergolas. And then there was me, Allison, the questioner, the experimenter, the one who took apart gadgets and asked why rules look so permanent when they were only habits. And while James was student body president and Stephanie homecoming queen, I was sketching wireframes and selling custom websites to local shops. A cute hobby, according to my parents, something to outgrow when real life arrived with a sensible degree in a safer job or a marriage as a contingency plan. And when I announced after graduation that I would skip college altogether to chase entrepreneurship, the family reacted as if I'd confessed to a crime. My father's jaw tight at a tense dinner 10 years ago as he said I would regret that decision for the rest of my life and refused to meet my eyes. And 6 months later, when I didn't return humbled and contrite, they created a narrative to soothe themselves, that I was drifting between couch and tiny apartment, that my ventures had failed, that I was too proud to ask for help. While in truth, I was surviving on ramen and resolve, cycling through false starts and near catastrophes, closing my eyes in borrowed offices at dawn and reopening them to iterate again, until one stubborn patent on a data shield for small businesses changed the slope of the graph. And after 3 punishing years, the company crested the hill and found traction, customers compounding, revenue steadying. And then the wild day 6 months ago when a larger firm acquired us for a number that made my hands shake, just over $50 million, enough to turn noise into quiet. And still, I told no one at home because every call and holiday visit had taught me the safety of being underestimated, how their low expectations were a cloak that kept me from their interrogations. Why settle down like Stephanie? Why not a real job like James? And beneath my calm, I was nursing the old sting of dismissal, the way condescension accumulates like dust until you're choking on it without noticing. And then 3 weeks ago, the phone rang with news that cut through everything. Mom had fallen and broken her hip. Dad's early-stage dementia was accelerating. And James, voice wrapped in thin judgment, called a family meeting to discuss care options and to ask whether I could manage to come home and contribute whatever I could, a phrase that landed like a pat on the head. So I booked a commercial flight even though the company jet was available, because I wasn't ready to disrupt their favorite story just yet. And on the morning I packed, I stood in my loft staring at a closet that contained 2 lives: the clean lines and quiet luxury that never needed logos, and the faded jeans and soft sweater with a tiny hole at the cuff that would match their idea of me. And I chose the latter, slipping worn sneakers onto my feet while my assistant Margot looked at me like I'd announced I was hiking Everest in ballet flats. "You are worth $50 million and you're dressed like a student going home for laundry," she said. "And you're taking a commercial flight instead of the jet?" I answered. "Because this is how they expect me to arrive. ponytail low, no jewelry but the thin band I wear as a promise to myself. They have a very specific picture of who I am, and I'm not ready to shatter it on the jetway. And somewhere in that choice was strategy too. Because in the boardroom, I had learned the leverage that hides inside being underestimated, how people reveal their tells when they don't feel threatened, how assumptions become open doors. And with my family, those doors had kept me from 100 tiresome explanations about why I value experiences over objects, why I fund schools abroad instead of kitchens with marble that must never suffer a knife mark. And there was something softer under the strategy, a bruise I didn't want anyone to press. The hurt of that last Christmas 5 years ago, when James told me some people are meant to lead and innovate, and others are meant to follow, and there's no shame in accepting your limitations. And I'd stepped outside pretending to take a call so no one would see me cry, hours after I'd signed the deal that took our product international. A day I should have been clinking glasses with my team, while I instead rehearsed the role of Camille Cautionary Tale. And on the plane back to Cedar Springs, I looked out over cotton fields of cloud and thought about how the town still held a hardware store where Dad bought nails one at a time, and the ice cream shop where we celebrated grades with chocolate sprinkles, and the park bench where I watched people fumble early smartphones and decided the world needed simpler ways to be safe online. And when the taxi rolled past those landmarks, everything looked smaller, preserved like moths in amber, while my life had expanded into rooms I still hadn't learned to inhabit. And when we turned onto the street with the white two-story colonial and blue shutters, and the maple tree thick with rings of our childhood, I felt the old reflexes return like muscle memory. The walk up the path, the breath you take before knocking, the way you gather yourself to accept being seen the old way. And I paid the driver, lifted my scuffed duffel because it told a story they understood, and I tightened my hand around a deliberately average handbag that held a phone buzzing with decisions from 3 time zones. And I told myself this was about Mom and Dad, not about vindication, not about spectacle, not yet. And the door swung open before I knocked, and there stood James in a cashmere sweater pressed into obedient lines as if leisure required tailoring, eyes flicking to my shoes, to the duffel, to the ponytail, a small, satisfied smile barely reaching his cheeks as he said, "Finally you're here. Were the flights delayed or did you take the bus?" And the old heat rose in my chest, but I smiled and hugged him anyway and asked about Mom and Dad. Because this was only the opening scene, and I already knew how the act would end.
James led me inside with the stiff politeness of someone entertaining a client rather than greeting his sister, his fingers tightening slightly on the worn strap of my duffel bag as its frayed edges confirmed every story he'd been telling himself about me for years. And as we stepped into the familiar living room, I saw Dad dozing in his recliner, thinner and grayer than the man I'd left behind, and Mom bustling slowly in the kitchen, her movement careful but her eyes lighting up when she saw me. "Allison, sweetheart," she said, pulling me close and searching my face for something she could compliment without betraying her disappointment at my deliberate plainness. "You look healthy. Are you eating enough on your budget? You know you can always call if you need help with groceries." And I smiled gently, assuring her I was fine, helping her ease into a chair while James hovered nearby with his leather binder of care facilities in medical terms, his voice sharp with practiced authority as he described the quality of different memory care units, their cost breakdowns and staff-to-patient ratios, all while casting sideways glances that reminded me he assumed I'd be contributing only token amounts. And as he closed the binder with a snap, he said, "We'll go through everything in detail at the meeting tomorrow, but I wanted you to have time to process the realities. Quality care isn't inexpensive." The word cost weeded deliberately in his mouth like a stone, and I nodded quietly, knowing that one account alone could cover the best care for both parents indefinitely. But tonight wasn't the time for revelations. Tonight was for reading the room, understanding just how deep their assumptions ran. Mom, determined to cling to ritual, insisted on preparing a family dinner despite her hip, but James, always 2 steps ahead in his own mind, had already arranged for a meal delivery from a boutique service. The roasted chicken golden, the garlic mashed potatoes whipped to perfection, artisan bread so fragrant my mother exclaimed that it must have cost a fortune, and she praised James's generosity while he waved it off with false modesty. "It's nothing, Mom. The firm had an excellent quarter. Besides, we should enjoy these family moments while we can," his words gliding effortlessly into the role of golden son. And just then the doorbell rang, and Stephanie swept in with her usual flourish, Andrew trailing behind under the weight of designer shopping bags, and Stephanie, flawless in her cashmere dress and pearls, her hair styled to look effortless but clearly anything but, embraced Mom with delicate care before presenting gifts: an expensive bottle of scotch for Dad, a silk scarf for Mom, a leather portfolio for James, and then pausing in front of me with a bright but brittle smile, handing me a small bag with a gift card to a mid-range clothing store, explaining with sisterly concern that she'd noticed my wardrobe could use refreshing, and this should help me pick up a few professional pieces for job interviews. And I thanked her evenly, pocketing the card, ignoring the sting beneath the gesture, her hand patting my arm with mock encouragement as she chirped, "We all want to see you succeed," before turning seamlessly to boast that Andrew had just made partner at his firm, and they were celebrating by renovating their kitchen with imported Italian marble. As dinner unfolded, the conversation orbited their accomplishments like planets around a sun. James's promotion, Stephanie's fundraising gala at the country club, and when the spotlight turned to me, it came wrapped in condescension. Stephanie asking what it was I did again, James offering to connect me with friends who might need basic websites, nothing major but at least reliable income, Dad asking if I still lived in that tiny apartment with the noisy neighbors, and I swallowed my pride and answered with half-truths, knowing the penthouse overlooking the city park, the executive team handling my schedule, the millions in equity, all of it would only shatter their narrative too soon, and I wasn't ready yet. Their laughter when Stephanie recalled my pride years ago in being able to buy name-brand cereal instead of generic still stung, though I smiled politely. And as dessert plates clinked, I felt the heat in my cheeks, not from shame, but from the clarity that tomorrow, in the bright light of the family meeting, I would no longer play this role they'd written for me. Tonight I stayed silent, storing their assumptions like ammunition, and when James spoke of fairness and contributions and Stephanie added that everyone should give according to their means, the glance they shared in my direction cut sharper than any words. And I thought to myself, tomorrow you will learn exactly what my means are, and the balance of this family story will shift forever. The official family meeting began promptly at 9 the next morning in our parents' living room. James already positioned at the head of the space with his laptop open and a portable projector casting neat slides against the far wall, the title Parental Care Options and Financial Considerations glowing above the framed family photos that had watched us grow up, and Stephanie and Andrew sat together on the love seat in their coordinated business casual, Mom and Dad in their usual chairs, while I found myself on the wobbly ottoman in the corner, an almost comical reminder of my role as the family afterthought. James launched into his presentation with the cadence of a boardroom pitch, moving through upscale facilities with manicured grounds, gourmet dining, cultural excursions, memory care wings, each slide more polished than the last, each number more staggering, and I watched Mom's eyes widen at the mention of monthly costs that dwarfed their retirement income, her hand tightening around Dad's, while Dad blinked, struggling to follow the jargon. James's preferred option was clear: a newly opened community with independent living apartments that could transition to higher care as needed, complete with walking paths, a golf course, and a two-bedroom unit with a garden terrace. And he spoke about it with an authority that assumed he alone had the power to decide. Then came the slide with numbers that made Mom gasp softly, a bright red gap between what Medicare and retirement would cover and what these luxuries would cost. And James turned to us, voice heavy with responsibility. "This is what we as a family need to address." Andrew leaned forward with banker's precision, announcing that he and Stephanie could cover 40%, James could manage 45% through bonuses and investments, leaving a 15% gap, about $1,200 a month. And then their eyes all turned to me, the unspoken question as loud as the silence that followed. I didn't answer right away, curious to see how they would frame it, and Stephanie cleared her throat delicately, her tone dripping with rehearsed compassion.
Allison, we know your situation is different. If that amount is too much, perhaps you could contribute in other ways. Maybe more visits, more personal care. We don't want to create hardship." And James, nodding gravely, added, "Perhaps 500 monthly would be more manageable. Stephanie and I could adjust to cover the rest." Their generosity was a theater mask, their condescension barely hidden, and I felt heat rise in my chest. Not because I couldn't afford it, but because they had already decided what I could and couldn't manage without asking, carving me into the role of the struggling sister who needed rescue. Mom, sighing, patted my hand, saying I had so much potential. She still didn't understand why I hadn't finished that business degree. I could have been successful like James. And James nodded with that polished air of certainty, adding that true success was measured in security, stability, the ability to care for family, that these were universal indicators of sound choices. And I sat quietly, while my heart drummed, debating whether to reveal my truth now or let them fully expose their assumptions before shattering them. Dad, who had been quiet, suddenly looked at me with concern, asking if I even had a steady job anymore. Last he'd heard, I was between projects. And before I could answer, James offered magnanimously, "My company has an entry-level marketing role opening. Modest salary, but for someone in Allison's position, it would provide stability and benefits. I could put in a word." And Stephanie beamed at him as though he'd offered me salvation, adding that a real job with a real company would make such a difference for me, while my teeth clenched behind a calm smile. I thanked them politely, said I was comfortable with my current situation. But James exchanged a knowing look with Stephanie, reminding me that comfort and security were different things, that I couldn't couch surf and freelance forever. And Stephanie chimed in with her own imagined evidence, recalling how I'd once mentioned having someone stay at my place, twisting it into proof of roommates and instability. I corrected them friendly, telling them I wasn't couch surfing, I had stable arrangements. But James pressed again, noting that I'd taken a taxi from the airport, questioning whether I even owned a car anymore. And their assumptions piled higher until Mom intervened weakly, trying to smooth things over by saying not everyone needed material success to be happy. Only for James to mutter under his breath that it was a convenient philosophy when success was out of reach. That was the moment something hardened in me, a tipping point where 10 years of condescension crystallized into perfect clarity. And I knew they would never see me clearly unless I forced them to. So when Andrew tried to steer us back to the numbers, asking if I could manage 500 a month so they could finalize contributions, I smiled faintly, pulled out my phone, and said I just needed to make a quick call, ignoring James's irritation that I was interacting serious family business. Dialing Margot instead, my voice calm as I confirmed, "Everything set for today? Perfect. Arrival in 15 minutes. Yes, the front lawn is big enough." And when I ended the call and tucked the phone away, I turned back to my confused family and said evenly, "Sorry, just confirming my transportation." And when James asked if I'd called another taxi, I smiled, not exactly a taxi, and leaned back in my chair, waiting for the sound I knew was about to change everything.
As if summoned by my calm defiance, the low rhythmic thrum of helicopter blades began to vibrate through the windows, and at first, no one reacted, assuming it was distant. But the sound grew louder until conversation faltered, and my mother, eyes wide, rose unsteadily to peer outside, gasping as a sleek black helicopter descended gracefully onto the front lawn, the downdraft bending the grass and rattling the branches of the maple tree. And Stephanie clutched Andrew's arm with a squeal, demanding to know if they should call the police, while James snapped that such theatrics were impossible. No one was allowed to land here. And I stood slowly, smoothing my faded sweater, every heartbeat measured, and said evenly, "That would be for me." And the silence that followed was so complete that I could hear the hum of the projector still running behind James, the slide frozen on projected monthly expenses, as if mocking their assumptions. 5 pairs of eyes drilled into me in disbelief. James demanded to know what was going on, Mom whispering my name as though she feared I'd been swept into someone else's story. And I moved toward the door with deliberate calm, pausing only to remind James of his earlier words that I couldn't even afford a car, saying, "You were right, I don't own a car," before opening the door to the sight of the pilot in crisp uniform, giving me a respectful nod. And I added, "My ride is here."
Behind me, Mom let out a faint cry before collapsing onto the couch. Dad stood frozen with his mouth open. Stephanie's knuckles turned white around Andrew's arm, and James' face looked as though the earth had tilted beneath him. And I told them simply that when Mom woke up, we could continue the conversation at my new place. The helicopter had plenty of room for everyone. As I stepped into the bright sunlight, hair whipping in the rotor wash, I felt a decade of swallowed pride lift like dust in the wind, and climbing into the leather seat, I accepted the headset from the pilot, who asked with concern if everything was all right, and I laughed softly, answering, "Just family drama, you know how it goes." And he chuckled, offering to circle a few times to give them something to talk about, but I told him to head straight to the estate. We'd be back soon enough to collect them. The helicopter banked over Cedar Springs, the streets of my childhood shrinking beneath us, the ice cream shop, the park, the roof of the colonial house where my younger self once pressed her nose to the glass wishing to be seen, all of it small now as the wooded hills rolled into view. And then my estate appeared, a 30-acre property I'd bought 6 months earlier when I knew I'd need both privacy and presence here. The historic mansion renovated with 10 bedrooms, modern amenities hidden behind its stone facade, the lake reflecting the sky, the gardens precisely landscaped, the guest houses tucked among trees, and the helipad waiting like a punctuation mark at the edge of the lawn. Margot stood there with her tablet in hand, the one person who would walk with me through the years when nothing was certain. And as I stepped out, she handed me water and asked how the grand reveal had gone. And I told her simply that Mom had fainted, the rest had gone silent as if they'd seen a ghost. And she smiled knowingly, reminding me that everything was ready for their arrival. The chef preparing lunch, the guest wing turned down, the family portfolio assembled, every detail in place for the next act of this story. I thanked her, and in her dry humor she quipped that without her, I'd probably buy another tech company just to pass the time. Then mentioned that Tokyo had sent the security proposal needing my attention tomorrow, and I promised I would review it tonight, but today was about family, about rewriting the narrative they had written over me for so long. An hour later, Rick the pilot radioed that he was en route back to collect them, and I braced myself, part of me regretting the dramatic entrance, but another part knowing it had been necessary, because words alone could never have cracked their armor of assumptions, but a helicopter on the front lawn had managed what a decade of explanations never could. And soon enough, the sound of blades returned, and this time when the aircraft settled on the estate lawn, it carried not just me, but all of them. Their faces still pale and stunned, Mom clutching her purse like a shield, Dad staring wide-eyed at the house, Stephanie's mouth literally hanging open, James blinking as if he might wake from a dream, and Andrew already scanning the grounds with the calculating gaze of a man tallying value. When they stepped out, I welcomed them simply, leading them toward the soaring foyer with its grand staircase and chandelier, and Mom finally found her voice to whisper, "This is yours?" And I answered quietly, "Yes, Mom, I purchased it 6 months ago when I decided to establish a regional office nearby." And James, finding his anger before his awe, demanded, "What kind of office? What kind of company?" And I let them into the living room with its floor-to-ceiling windows and said calmly, "Parker Security Solutions, my company." The words landing like stones in still water, breaking the silence into ripples of disbelief. And then came James's voice, flat and incredulous. "Since when do you have a company? How could you possibly afford this?" And I told them the truth at last, that I had founded it 8 years ago, that we specialize in cybersecurity, that 6 months ago it had been acquired for just over $50 million, and I retained leadership and equity. And the silence that followed was deeper than any I'd ever heard in that family. Stephanie paling, James's jaw tightening, Dad whispering my name with a tremor of pride and shock, and Mom sinking into the sofa whispering that all this time they thought I was struggling. And for the first time, I let their disbelief hang in the air without rushing to soften it, because this was the moment they finally had to see me as I truly was.
Stephanie looked like she might faint herself, clutching Andrew's arm as though the marble floor might tilt beneath her, while James' expression shifted from disbelief to something harder, his pride refusing to surrender even in the face of undeniable truth. And my father, voice low and trembling, repeated the number as though tasting it on his tongue. 50 million, before adding with tears bright in his eyes, "My Allison." And I moved to sit beside him, touching his hand gently, saying, "Yes, Dad, still your Allison, always, but also someone you never really saw clearly until now." My mother, still shaken, asked why I had let them believe all these years that I was barely surviving, and Stephanie finally found her voice to accuse me of letting them worry while I lived in luxury, her words sharp with both outrage and shame. And I raised an eyebrow at her, asking whether she had truly been worried or whether she had found comfort in believing I had failed, reminding her of the gift card she'd given me the night before for job interview clothes, and the way she blushed and looked away was answer enough. James tried to reclaim control by accusing me of deceiving them, of making fools of them, and I met his anger evenly, saying I had not created their assumptions, they had done that themselves. Dismissing every attempt I'd made to share my work as "that computer thing Allison does," changing the subject whenever I tried to explain. And when Mom started to protest that the old clothes and taxis suggested poverty, I cut her off firmly, but without cruelty, telling her those were choices, that I lived simply by preference, that I drove a 10-year-old car because I liked it, that I flew commercial that weekend because I wanted privacy, that none of it meant I couldn't afford more, only that material display was never how I measured success. Andrew, breaking his silence, asked practically whether the Westbrook Foundation I'd mentioned earlier was truly mine. And I nodded, signaling to Margot, who appeared with the leather portfolio, handing it to me so I could open it and show them documents, trusts, healthcare provisions, legal frameworks, explaining how I had already secured places for Mom and Dad at the care community, how every expense was already covered, how I had done this quietly because I loved them, not because I wanted recognition. James's voice cracked between awe and frustration as he demanded to know why I had shut them out, why I had taken on such responsibilities without telling them. And I told him plainly that I had needed to, because I knew what would happen if I tried to include them, that they would have questioned, doubted, tried to take control, and today's meeting had proved me right. My mother's tears fell freely now, her apologies tumbling over themselves, saying they had never meant to make me feel lesser. And I told her softly that intent did not erase impact, that every offer of an entry-level job, every pat on the hand, every reminder that I had potential but was wasting it had sent a message louder than any kindness. And for once, she fell silent, acknowledging truth in the stillness. Stephanie tried to insist she had only wanted to help, but I challenged her gently yet firmly, asking if she truly wanted to help or if she needed to validate her own choices by making mine look like failure. And the room hung heavy with my words, uncomfortable but undeniable. And for the first time in years, none of them rushed to fill the silence with justifications. Dad, eyes clearer than they had been all weekend, reached for my hand and said he had always known I was different, not lesser, but different, that he had never understood what I was building, but he believed me now. And that moment, more than the gasps at the helicopter or the shock in the foyer, felt like the recognition I had been yearning for all along. Margot discreetly signaled that lunch was ready, and I invited everyone to move to the dining room, where the long table was set with china and flowers. And as we sat together for the first time in years, with curiosity replacing judgment, my mother asked about my life in the city, Stephanie wanted to know about my travels, and even James leaned in to ask about how I had built the company. His tone stripped of superiority, his questions for once genuine. For years I had imagined this day as a triumph, their shocked faces my victory. But as the conversation deepened, I realized the real revelation was not their astonishment at my wealth, but their willingness, finally, to listen to who I truly was.
After lunch, I led them through the estate, the sprawling grounds stretching under a sky so clear it felt like an omen. The main house gleaming with its restored stonework, the guest cottages tucked among trees, and the newly built office wing where a small team would soon begin regional projects. And as we walked, I could sense the tension thinning, replaced by something stranger. Embarrassment mixed with awe, pride struggling with humility. And in the garden overlooking the lake, we settled on the patio for coffee, the sunlight soft on the water as questions began to flow more naturally, my father leaning forward, his eyes clearer than they had been all weekend as he asked when I had known my company will succeed. And I told him truthfully, there was never one moment, that in the first 3 years we nearly went bankrupt twice, that I had lived in a leaking studio apartment and worked 18-hour days sustained only by stubbornness. And my mother, voice full of ache, asked why I hadn't asked for help during those times. And I said gently that every offer of help came laced with conditions, that accepting their aid would have meant admitting my path was wrong, and I needed to prove to myself that it wasn't. James, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, finally spoke, setting down his cup and admitting that he owed me an apology, that he had built assumptions about me that said more about his insecurities than my choices. And his words startled me because my brother almost never admitted fault. And when I asked what insecurities he meant, he sighed and confessed that he had followed the prescribed path: Ivy League, corporate ladder, country club membership, everything expected, but that he secretly hated 60% of his daily life. And my mother guessed, saying he had never confessed unhappiness before. But he explained that admitting dissatisfaction would have meant admitting he might have chosen wrong. And so when I chose differently, he needed me to fail to validate his own choices. And my success threatened the entire story he told himself about his life. Stephanie, who had been restless, twisted her wedding ring before finally speaking softly, saying she felt the same, that her life looked perfect in photos, but that she and Andrew had been in counseling for a year, that the galas and country clubs often felt empty. And Andrew nodded, adding that they were reassessing what truly mattered, that the big house and social veneer had costs they hadn't anticipated. And their honesty struck me deeply, because for years I had believed them perfectly content while I was the outcast. And now I saw they too carried doubts, regrets, and longings for something real. My father, eyes misted, asked if I had hidden my success as punishment for their disbelief. And the sting of his words pierced me, because in part it was true, that I had fantasized about the moment of revelation, about watching their certainty collapse. But I admitted quietly that, at first, I stayed silent out of fear it wouldn't last. Then it became habit, then protection, and yes, maybe also a desire for dramatic vindication, which I now regretted. Stephanie managed a small laugh through her tears, saying the helicopter entrance had been a bit extra, and I laughed with her, conceding that it wasn't my most mature moment, but that James's remark about me not affording a car had been the spark that set years of frustration alight. And James, to his credit, admitted he had deserved that, though Mom interjected that fainting was perhaps an extreme response, and Andrew, always the banker, muttered under his breath that technically I was not just a millionaire, but a multimillionaire. And we all turned to him until he shrugged sheepishly, saying it was a professional reflex. Slowly, the conversation shifted back to practical matters, this time with me fully included, as I explained Westbrook's philosophy of care. Small, home-like residences with personalized plans, trust funds already established, expenses covered in perpetuity, and I stressed this was not about me taking control, but about all of us deciding together, as equals. And James repeated the word thoughtfully, saying it would take adjustment, and I admitted it would for me too, because I had lived so long defining myself in opposition that I wasn't sure how to simply be sister and daughter again. Yet, as we talked, something genuine began to root, fragile but unmistakable, a chance to rebuild not on old judgments, but on truth. And I realized the helicopter had cracked the surface, but it was honesty, raw and imperfect,
that might finally heal the fractures between us.
As the afternoon softened into evening, the estate began to feel less like a stage for confrontation and more like neutral ground where a new version of us could cautiously emerge. And when I invited them to stay in the guest wing, everyone agreed for different reasons. Stephanie with excitement at the luxury, James with quiet relief at not having to face a long drive in his shaken state, and my parents simply happy to have all their children under one roof again. And dinner that night, prepared by my chef, became a strange blend of tension and laughter, moments of hurt resurfacing alongside moments of connection. Stephanie admitting she felt excluded from my real life, James still bristling defensively at his career choices, my parents whispering regrets about not supporting me more when I chose entrepreneurship, but then laughter bubbling up as we shared childhood stories, like the time James fell out of the maple tree and blamed me, or when Stephanie's tiara broke before homecoming and I fixed it with superglue. Moments that reminded us of ties older than judgment. Later, while dessert plates were cleared, Stephanie leaned toward me incredulously, asking if I had really flown to Tokyo for just one day to meet investors. And when I nodded, she sighed that she couldn't imagine such freedom. And I assured her it was less glamorous than it sounded, that I had been so jet-lagged I'd salted my coffee by mistake. And she laughed in genuine amusement. And even James admitted he was beginning to understand that no path guaranteed happiness, that we all simply did our best with the choices we made. His words humbler than I had ever heard. Afterward, we gathered in the living room, conversation flowing easier, but the moment that crystallized the shift came when Mom knocked her coffee cup and gasped in horror at the stains spreading across the expensive carpet, apologizing frantically, saying the rug probably cost more than their car, and I took her hand gently and told her it was just a rug, replaceable, and that what mattered was this conversation, this fragile new honesty, not things. And I watched her shoulders relax as if for the first time she believed me when I said material possessions never defined me. Later, as night spread across the lake, I stood on the terrace, lost in thought, when James joined me with 2 glasses of whiskey from my collection, and for once his voice carried admiration without envy, as he said I had done well, not just in money or estates, but in building something meaningful on my own terms, something he admitted took courage he wasn't sure he had. And I told him it was never too late to change, that hating 40% of his life still left room to aim higher. And he laughed softly, calling me the eternal optimist. And we clinked glasses in a quiet toast to new beginnings. The next morning, sunshine streamed through tall windows and we all gathered for breakfast, the table laden with pastries, fruit, omelets, coffee, and for the first time, conversation flowed naturally, Mom marveling again that I had founded a care facility and asking how I'd even known what was needed. And I explained about research after Dad's diagnosis, how I'd been frustrated by institutional models that stripped dignity, how I wanted to build something where joy mattered as much as safety. And James, who had toured it yesterday, admitted he was impressed by the design details and the residents' happiness. And Stephanie, surprisingly earnest, asked if she could volunteer there, confessing her charity work had felt hollow. And I told her sincerely that her design eye would be valuable, that the arts program could use her. And she smiled in a way I hadn't seen in years, as though she glimpsed a role beyond performance. For the first time, we discussed practical matters as equals, about timelines for Mom and Dad, about legal steps, about staying connected, and when we posed for a family photo in the garden afterward, the smiles felt real, not staged. And I realized that the true shock of the weekend wasn't the helicopter or the estate, but this, my family beginning to see me and themselves without the old filters.
Before anyone began packing to leave, I asked them to gather once more in the living room, sunlight spilling across the polished floor as though inviting honesty. And I told them quietly that while professional success had given me wealth, it had also carried personal costs I was only now beginning to face. That I had spent 10 years defining myself in opposition to this family, fueled by the need to prove them wrong, and that in the process, I had sometimes lost sight of what I truly wanted beyond validation, building walls that kept judgment out, but also kept connection away. And my father, his voice steady with rare clarity, observed that family systems are complicated. Everyone contributes to patterns. And I agreed, telling them healing needed to involve all of us, not just me showing them a different version of success. And I explained that I intended to split my time between the city and this estate, wanting to rebuild relationships based on who we really were, instead of roles we had been trapped in. My mother reached for my hand, saying she longed to know the real Allison, not just the version she imagined. And I promised the same, that I wanted to know them beyond the polished masks of golden son, perfect daughter, proud parents. James, clearing his throat, admitted he was considering leaving his corporate track for a teaching position at the business school. Less money, but more meaning, inspired by seeing what I had built. And I told him sincerely that he had always been a natural teacher. Stephanie, emboldened, confessed she was tired of hollow charity galas and wanted to focus on hands-on community work. And Andrew added that he was exploring ethical investment counseling for nonprofits. And as my parents listened with pride, it struck me that the revelation of my success had given permission for all of us to rethink what success meant. The weekend closed with preparations for departure, the helicopter no longer a symbol of division, but merely a convenient way to take Mom and Dad home. And as we hugged goodbye, Mom asked if I would come for Sunday dinner next week. Nothing fancy, just family. And I told her yes, just family sounded perfect. After the house grew quiet, I walked the halls alone, reflecting that while the dramatic reveal had forced them to see me differently, the real victory was not their shock, but the possibility of authentic connection now opening between us. And as I settled with my laptop on the terrace, the lake glowing in the golden sunset, I felt lighter than I had in years, aware that old patterns would resurface, but also certain something had shifted forever. And I realized true wealth was not measured in helicopters or estates, but in relationships where you can be fully yourself and still be loved. And so I leave you with this question. Have you ever been underestimated by your own family, forced to prove yourself before they could finally see you, or carried the weight of judgment that blinded them to who you really are? If you have, drop a comment below and share your story, because our experiences might give someone else the courage to keep going. And if this resonated with you, don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories like this. And above all, remember that success wears many faces, but its truest form is found in authentic connection, not possessions.